Hello again, everyone. As always, joined by Joe Resinello. And once more, dear brothers and sisters, let us go into the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith in the New York City metropolitan area. Please be sure to download the Veritas Catholic Radio Network mobile so that you could have access to all of our station's content, not just the Frontline with Joe and Joe. Of course, if you'd like to give some feedback, you could go on the website, catholic.com. There'll be a section there for you to offer feedback to us. Whether you love us, whether you hate us, or anywhere in between, we certainly value your opinion. And finally, if you'd like, please follow Joe and I on social media. You could find us at the Frontline TV, primarily on YouTube. And today we are very pleased and honored to be joined by Professor Russell Berman. And Russell has written an article recently in First Things magazine, State of Emergency. That is the title of the article. All of you know, one of the things that Joe and I do, we try to look at, what's going on out there, try to pinpoint those who really are spot on, whether they're writing a book, an article, whether it's in First Things, whether it's in Crisis Magazine, wherever it might be. If it's something that Joe and I feel is worthy to talk about, we're going to talk about it on the show. Russell was gracious enough. We sent him an invitation to come on the show, and he agreed to do so. So we're very excited to be talking to Professor Berman about the state of emergency. And I want to give a brief bio. Russell A. Berman, the Walter A. Haas Professor in the Humanities at Stanford, is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and chair of the Working Group on the Middle East and the Islamic World. At Stanford, he's a member of both the Department of German Studies and the Department of Comparative Literature. He has received many honors and awards, including a Mellon Faculty Fellowship at Harvard, 1982 and 83, and Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship in 88 and 89. He received his BA in 1972 from Harvard and his doctorate from Washington University in 1979. Professor Russell Berman, welcome to the Frontline with Joe and Joe.
Joe, thanks so much for having me here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. If you ask me, it's going to be a barn burner. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe Resinello.
Professor Berman, we always start with the prayer. It's our custom. So in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, never was it known that anyone who sought your help or sought your intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto you, a virgin of virgins, our mother. To you we come, before you we stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in your clemency hear and answer us. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Professor Berman told us before the show that he's a Boston guy, so we love him that much more, actually.
That's right.
So it's good stuff. We're going to be talking to mostly our folks in Fairfield County, Connecticut, so I'm sure they can appreciate that. As Joe said, we're going to be discussing the state of emergency. It's a recent article that's in First Things, and in it, Professor Berman, he gives an example of certain shocks to the system over recent years that have led to illiberalism. Russell, could you please give us a couple of examples of this, of how illiberalism is justified by invocations of the state of emergency?
Joe, sure. Thanks for the question. And again, thanks for having me here. Let me back up a little bit. We're in strange times. All times may be strange. These are very strange times. It's a time in which liberals are often acting in illiberal ways, and people who aren't necessarily liberal, conservatives, find themselves defending liberal rights. So things are turning a little topsy-turvy here. What's up? We're at a turning point in the globalization that has politics, economy the past couple of conflicts, the competition with China, and now the war in Ukraine. So it's very dramatic. Argue shocks have led leadership to move toward illiberal measures, or an inclination to illiberal measures that run under the flag of state of emergency. What do I mean by that? A big, big game changer, I believe, has been the internet. I mean, that sounds trivial. Everybody can say that, but what I mean in particular is this: when the internet, I'm speaking to you from California, when the internet was rolling out, there was a lot of optimism about it as a force for democratization. Give everybody a voice. Everybody could voice their opinion and gain a public. To some extent, actually, that really happened. Right? Everybody can get on the internet, and all of a sudden, the traditional gatekeepers, the opinion makers, are now some wildly false, some just divergent, some nonconformist can circulate. And they're no longer subject to control by the editorial board of the Washington Post or the New York Times. The gatekeepers have been, they have not by no means lost all their authority, but they can no longer restrict the circulation of opinion. You mentioned somewhat unkindly that I graduated with my B from 1972, so you're versed listeners can figure out my age. I grew up at a time when there were 3 networks and they all gave you the same news at 6 o'clock in the evening. Now we get news, we consume news very, very, very differently any time of day, and we can construct our own feeds to get the opinions that we want to hear. One response to that has been the discussion about so-called fake news. As I said before, there's stuff on the internet that is patently wrong. Right? But when you start talking about fake news, the next step can only be censorship, whether it's done by the government or done by by industry, and it's liberal and it me illiberal. At what point are my views to be censored because some authority will declare them fake?
Well, Russell, isn't fake? I mean, let's just stay there for 1 second. But isn't that very subjective? I mean, I don't know why people would buy into this or in any way. Who's you mentioned the gatekeepers. Okay, what standard are they using to determine what's fake news, what's not? And they'll say, well, what's true? But then again, they're trying to tell something that we can obviously see with our eyes is not true. It's like, don't believe your lying eyes. Okay,
yeah.
That type of like. Who's going to determine what fake news is? And in a free market of ideas, why should there be anybody determining that? In a free marketplace of ideas in the internet, you say something that I think is foolish and stupid and a lie, I could come online and I could refute what you're saying. It's a free marketplace. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I'm with you, but I see movements toward restrictions of that free marketplace of ideas. Disallowing certain claims. President Trump banned Twitter. The recent effort by the Biden administration to establish a disinformation governance board, which has not been canceled, it has only been suspended, and we don't know what's going to come back. My point, though, more broadly, is that align with your comment now, Joe. When we start talking about fake news as a problem that has to be addressed, it's very likely that the answer is going to be some form of censorship, whether it's the government that carries it out or whether the government puts pressure on private industry to carry it out is really secondary. That's one point. You're asking me how we get to state of emergency. State of emergency is the opinion makers are freaking out that Secondly, the climate discussion, I won't dwell on as extensively, but it's been phrased so much in terms of an ultimate catastrophe. We're always at 2 minutes to midnight, right? It's always about to be the end of life as we've known it. But we've been hearing that for so many years, we've become a little bit inert to that. Nonetheless, the insistence that we're facing a dramatic and existential crisis all the time pushes toward the state of emergency. 2 other examples of what are the shocks to the system that generate the apparent calls for emergency declarations. Politically, I think the 2016 presidential election was a shock to the system, not only because President Trump was elected, but because Bernie Sanders almost became the Democratic candidate.
Mm-hmm.
The way I phrase this, and this is a kind of bipartisan phrasing, so please appreciate that. In both major parties, there was effectively a populist upsurge against the respective establishments. In the Republican Party, it was Trump against the Republican establishments, many of whom then turned into the Republican never-Trumpers. And in the Democratic Party, it was the Sanders wing that was rebelling against the Democratic establishment. The populist wing, the populist revolt in the Democratic Party lost, and Hillary Clinton became the candidate. The populist revolt in the Republican side won. My point is not to relitigate that election or to take sides here, but just to note that all of a sudden something really unexpected happened in one party and almost happened in the other party too. And I think there's been an instinctive response on the part of the establishment to say, wow, we've got to get this under control. We've got to manage opinion. We've got to keep order, right? In a way that we used to keep order. And all of that came home to roost, I think, in the COVID crisis, right? I am not a COVID denier. I think there really has been a pandemic. Maybe it's almost over. Let's hope so. I think it was wise to take certain kinds of measures, but the way it was framed, it was explicitly a state of emergency in all states. And that state of emergency allowed for an accrual of executive authority on the state level primarily to take steps that restricted the liberties that we are accustomed to be thankful for. Freedom of travel, freedom of religion, freedom of association. Curtailed, and frankly, freedom of speech, because those who were critical of some of the COVID measures, some who proposed the lab leak theory, for example, were vilified and in some cases banned from. There we had a real state of emergency that led specifically to limitations on freedom, and that's what I'm worried about.
Russell,
Absolutely.
I want to back
Russell,
up for a second. Okay, Joe, please.
I was going to say Russell Berman is joining with Joe and Joe Pasillo and Joe Rossinello, and this is a conversation we are way in the breach. Russell has written an article called "The State of Emergency," and you could find the written article. It's an extensive article at First Things, but we're here talking about it at the front line with Joe and Joe Rossinello. You
said about like the expression of information, and basically, the elites had to basically curtail that. That to me says very clearly we're not living in a democracy, that this is an oligarchy. And they're almost like, listen, I cannot have you believe this or say this. This has to go through a filter. That goes against everything this country is about. We have a free press. We have a free press. And I would agree with you wholeheartedly. The elites on both sides of the aisle control that through a filter. And they do not want people to speak, even if it's true. And let's be honest, there are things that have been said that are true. They cannot have that. Comment on that, because I think that's one of the things that when I read your article, like there's people that would vehemently deny that. They would say the deep state. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? That points directly to an oligarchy, that we control the information. I'm not interested in what you have to say. I want your vote. And that's where it ends. What are your thoughts on that?
Lots of thoughts. The strongest argument to worry about disinformation is that bad foreign players, Putin, tries to influence American public opinion through the insertion of false claims in their circulation, maybe to influence elections. I don't doubt that might happen. I think foreign countries are often trying to intervene in public opinion in all countries. In the United States, foreign agents like that have to register as lobbyists, and that's just part of the system. But I'm not convinced that Putin's efforts to influence the election really had a significant effect. There's no evidence of that, and that's the interesting point. More generally, though, Joe, I think we do live in a democracy, and I think we live in a system that wants to be a democracy, but it is subject to oligarchical pressures. That is, there are some very rich people who can deploy their resources to try to shape public opinion, and they're going to have more resources than I. I'm not an oligarch. We're not living in Putin's Russia. We're living in the United States of America, where we can have this conversation, and I'm fairly confident that you're going to be able to broadcast it, right? Even though it's going to be at odds with oligarchic opinion. So I think we're living in a democracy that faces pressure from establishment forces that want to control opinion. So I'm with you, but I also think that we should not lose sight of the fact that we can speak up, and we can criticize, and we can protest, and we should.
I think when we do, I think we've seen signs of hope out there. I think when we do, and we stand up to the bullies, let's face it, that's what they are. They're bullies. That's what those who would aspire to be tyrants usually are. We see the things that they do. One thing, Professor Russell Berman joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe, that I don't understand is how. And I want you to just touch on this briefly. Give our audience some examples, probably in recent history, where a quote unquote state of emergency, manufactured probably, has been used to allow those who would rule the ability to amass more power to the state. Not necessarily even just in America. Why we need to be on guard for this, that it's not conspiracy theory to say, wait a minute, you're telling us all these things, and your solution to it is for us to give you this much more power that we don't want to. But tell our audience some recent examples in modern history where this has been used, this state of emergency tactic has been used for the oligarchs to grant themselves more power.
It's oligarch is a very specific term, but I think the crux of the matter is, when does a declaration of state of emergency have what kinds of consequences? Let's not forget. I mean, there can be real emergencies, right? The tsunami is heading toward Manhattan, right? Or I'm sitting in the Bay Area. There's an earthquake here. There could well be justification for a state of emergency. So there could be unrest that would lead to reasons to suspend Miranda declarations, for example. Right? I don't deny that might well happen. We should be able to defend our system against real emergencies. The question is whether those declarations of emergencies are instrumentalized to accrue power or demonstrate a kind of political agenda in terms of the powers that be. I don't have to go to ancient history. Just think back to the COVID era and the summer of the BLM riots, the George Floyd riots. We were being told, well, first we were told that we shouldn't buy masks. Then we were told that we should get masks and that we should use masks all the time, except, by the way, when you go to the BLM demonstrations, you don't need masks. So all of a sudden, it was as if the circulation of the virus was contingent on one's political position. This I think is a school book example of the political bias in the utilization of the extraordinary powers that state of emergency can confer. Again, there may well be cases where you want a state of emergency. In my article, I talk about the whole notion the Constitution is not a suicide pact. We want a state that can defend itself.
Well, define that if you don't mind, Russell, because I know that probably Joe was going to go there anyway with the next question. Hash that out a little bit as far as what does that mean? Where does that phrase come from, and how does that impact this affect this conversation that we're having today?
Okay, so the notion that the Constitution is not a suicide pact is a phrase in U.S. constitutional law, and the Constitution of the United States is one that, in fact, allows for limited government in order to protect the rights of the citizens and the states. But some judicial thinkers believe there may be situations in which the government has to take steps that would curtail constitutionally guaranteed liberties. The historic example before the utilization of this phrase was when Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, suspended the need to justify arrests in the context of the outbreak of the Civil War. We faced a real insurrection there, not some faux insurrection, not some pseudo insurrection, but the southern states were rebelling, and Washington, the capital, was in danger. Therefore, the executive authority, the president, suspended rights in order to protect the viability of the state. I think that was probably a right decision. It was unconstitutional. The notion that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, that phrase goes back to Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson of 1949, where he contributed to a case. We don't have to get into the details, but saying that yes, we have freedom of speech, but if it's freedom of speech that's inciting to a riot, the state has to guarantee order. The Constitution is not a suicide pact, and the phrase was repeated again in 1960s by Justice Goldberg in a case about the draft. We don't have to get into the details of those cases, but we cherish our Constitution because it protects our liberties. There might be some real situations where the state should defend order against excessive liberty, excessive utilization of liberty, and therefore states of emergency can be a framework in which the sovereign, the state, the government acts to protect order, but it shouldn't be the normal state of affairs. The normal state of affairs should be one of freedom.
Russell, we're going to come back to that point after the break, but let's get to a couple other things before the break, because I want to come back to that after the break. You're listening to The Front Line with Joe Pasillo and Joe Rossinello. We are way in the breach on the Veritas Catholic Network with Professor Russell Berman, and we're discussing his recent article in First Things magazine, which is the state of emergency. This is an important conversation. When you hear it, especially if you're downloading it on the podcast, send it to your friends, share it. Professor Berman's got a lot to say about this, and we're going to scratch the surface. I would encourage everyone to go on First Things after listening to this and read the article. It's an extensive article where Russell gives examples like he was just talking about, suspension of habeas corpus and other things. It's more in depth, a lot more than we could get into here, but we're trying with that. Joe Rossinello.
You talked about basically, the Constitution isn't a suicide pact. We saw in the 2020 election, and I'm going to focus particularly on Pennsylvania, where you saw judges extend voting times. Now, Clarence Thomas wrote extensively about the danger of that, and the Supreme Court refused to take that case. Now, I'm not saying that would have changed the outcome of that state, but is that such a situation, an emergency where, let's be honest, the state, through the legislation, the voting of the people, decide the election laws, and they usurp that? Clarence Thomas wrote, and I invite all people to read what he said, that is dangerous. Justice Roberts did not take that case. Please comment on that. Is that an example of what we're talking about?
It's in the same universe. Yes, it is. It's I don't know if the Pennsylvania judges were talking specifically about state of emergency, but I believe their logic was COVID makes us change the rules, and therefore, abracadabra, I, judge in Pennsylvania, appointed, elected, whatever, I can decide how this is going to work. That was probably unconstitutional. I'm not a Supreme Court justice. I trust Justice Thomas on this. I believe the terms of elections are reserved for state legislatures, not for the courts. Why Justice Roberts wouldn't take it, I can't say. But there's one of the features of our democracy, and again, this is a bipartisan comment now, is a increased predisposition to doubt the outcome of elections. We're familiar with President Trump and the 2020 election, but it really goes back to the 2000 election, the hanging Chad election in Florida. Democrats have criticized Republicans for trying to disqualify the electoral votes of some states, but Democrats have done that in the past as well. Both parties are playing fast and loose, I think, with the terms of elections. We live in this terribly litigious society where everything is up for a lawsuit, and this includes the outcome of elections. So there's a fragility in democracy there. If by democracy, one of the meanings of democracy is you have elections and the results are determining.
It really bothers me, and we are a bit partisan. I'm not gonna deny that. Russell Berman joining us at the front line with Joe and Joe. I understand the idea that Republicans do it too, but it just seems to me that the Democrats recently have shown they don't have any limits on what they're capable of doing. Whether it was trying to use COVID, whether it's trying to use like I'll give you an example. You just mentioned, or you mentioned earlier about the Ministry of Disinformation, whatever it is. It's only been suspended. Okay, those who perpetrate or spread disinformation and misinformation are the ones who want to control what they consider to be disinformation and misinformation. Because I feel like we've been fed a lot of malarkey over the last, let's call it since Trump decided to come on the scene. Okay. And probably before then. Like, we're always being fed this line. I wonder who's given the misinformation. Quick comment on that, Russell. We have about 2 minutes before we go to the break, and then we'll get into some more meat on the other side.
Well, with regard specifically to the suspended Office of Disinformation Governance, or whatever it was called, you're absolutely right. The proposed head of it was thoroughly culpable of spreading disinformation on a number of issues. She's withdrawn her candidacy, I guess. But listen. I think sometimes it's useful to try to be bipartisan in objective analysis, but I agree with you fully that there's a fundamental asymmetry in the standard behavior of the two parties. For better or for worse, Republicans have been, sorry for the gendering of this term, gentlemanly in elections.
Be careful there, Russell. Be careful. You don't want to get us yourself in trouble. But go ahead.
In the way Democrats are not. It's the what was the phrase? If they bring a knife to the fight, you bring a gun. I think that in a sense, it's too bad that now everybody's bringing a gun.
Right. Let's take a quick break. Russell Berman joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. The article that Russell's written is State of Emergency. You could read the full article at First Things, and we're very honored that Russell has agreed to come on the show and discuss this with Joe and I. So you're listening to us on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network. We have another great segment coming up on the other side of the break. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe Pasillo and Joe Resinello. We are way in the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network. We have Russell Berman on our show today, and we are discussing his recent article in First Things Magazine, State of Emergency. With that, I'm handing it over to Joe Resinello.
Russell, in your article, another thing that I thought was very interesting and very accurate was you said basically the politically correct context as far as how we're supposed to speak is not that of the common man. It's basically dictated from the elite. And I see that. I live in New Jersey. It's a blue state, but I live in a middle-class town, and many people are Democrats. The Democrat in, say, my neighborhood, who, say, is a state trooper, does not have the same thought process as, say, the Democrat on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. James Carville, who is a Democratic strategist, put it this way. He said, the people at the University of Chicago are not speaking the same language as the people on the South Side of Chicago, yet they lead us to believe that, yes, that is the case. And this is what you said in the article. You said minority communities assumed to be progressive often display cultural conservative currents at odds with the liberal ideology. Residents in disadvantaged communities are not eager to lose police protection, speaking specifically about that, no matter how loudly liberals clamor for defunding the police. I know it's a larger question. You could address both issues, police versus language, but I'm interested in your comments.
Which the policing of language is a consequence of highly educated, I guess counts me too, people, liberals, which doesn't count me, trying to project their norms onto the language of the people. And as Carville points out, that's not the way normal people speak, and it's not making inroads into the speech of normal people. Most people of Hispanic background have no idea what Latinx is, but this is university speak for a way to avoid gendering that term. So it's not Latino, not Latina, because you have to have a third gender too. So Latinx. I suppose that may make sense in some academic department. It makes no sense outside of the borders of the university, and all the other efforts to control speech are have very little echo in the population at large. Maybe the real function of those efforts to control speech is not so much to get people to use that, but to exercise control. I think this is the point where liberalism itself becomes repressive, where liberalism itself becomes illiberal in its efforts to restrict others' speech. Now, the specific issue would say, example, we should reduce policing anywhere, but especially in communities that face high crime rates. Makes no sense except to ideologues who don't have to know.
And anything, we're from New Jersey, Russell. Okay, we've seen what the lack of policing, or lax policing could do. I mean, the place is a war zone. We've done some work with some Franciscan friars that have a ward in Newark. One of the friars, I remember telling me one time, he says, Joe, I've been every place in the world, some of the worst places in the world. This is the worst place in the world. They would make you believe that those people that are living in the Central Ward in Newark, let's say, hate the police or don't want the police. But again, it's a narrative that they have to try to peddle. And that's one of the reasons why I'm glad Joe asked that question and why you addressed it in your article at First Things, is that no, minority communities are not monolithic. I've said about Hispanic Americans, if Hispanic Americans really knew, who for the most part are Christian in general and Catholic in particular, if they really knew what the Democrat Party stood for on a number of issues, they'd never vote Democrat. And I think that's one of the reasons why they have to control information, is because they don't want minority communities hearing about exactly what, let's say in the case of Democrats, what they stand for. And let me segue real quick, Russell, from that. Russell Berman joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe to something we really need to get into. And I want to make sure we do feeling if we wanted to, we could go on for hours. But this is an important one. I think it's important for you to address. You wrote in your article, in First Things, in our current situation, quote, in addition to government measures, a public-private partnership is emerging that seeks to coerce behavior and opinion into ideological grooves. Please describe this partnership, Russell Berman, and why it's so dangerous to our liberties.
Well, the private-public partnership is the form that censorship had been taking when Congress, Democratic Congress, was pushing the social media companies to restrict opinion. The banning of President Trump from Twitter was maybe the most egregious example, but there were all sorts of positions that were just not allowed to circulate, with of course the expected ideological bias that forms of left-wing extremism, they're not subject to censorship, but center-right positions may well be. Up until the proposed disinformation governance board, this was being outsourced to etc., to limit what can be said. And of course, the often liberal mid-level employees in these industries were very, very happy to comply. With the Disinformation Governance Board, there was a step almost taken to take this back into government. And the point is that sometimes we think about government versus industry, but here it was a significant part of the government cooperating with significant industry in order to public discourse.
Yeah, and I mean, in our lifetimes, Joe and I are in our early 50s. I mean, in our lifetimes, we remember the most hated business. They hated industry. They hated these used to be multi-billionaires. Now it's tens of billionaires. When you talk about the wealth that they have, they're all in bed with each other now. Yeah, in other words, all of a sudden, the left loves guys who are worth tens of billions of dollars. They love Bill Gates. They love these guys. They loved Elon Musk up until about 2 months ago when he decided he was going to take over Twitter. But we're not going to get into that too much. Thank you for that, Russell Berman, joining us at the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo, Joe Rossinello on the Veritas Catholic Network. Joe Rossinello, where do you want to go?
I want to talk about something you said before that last question about the police. You basically said that was kind of a crazy idea, and I think it was. This idea that you're going to stand down. I've never seen anything like it. I did not live through the riots in the 60s, but I did see the riots in 2020, particularly in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I cannot understand how you allow a mob to burn a police station down in the United States of America. I don't care what you stand for. I don't understand that. And then we see in cities like New York, which I work in, I commute there every day. I have seen the change. Russell, you should see Manhattan now. It's back in the 70s, in the times of like Escape from New York movies.
Back to the bad old days.
It clearly had an impact. And what I want to throw out to you is these are smart people that are making these decisions. Was it to create instability? Was it specifically to create instability? Because like you said, neighborhoods, if you live in the Bronx and now it's unsafe to take the subway, if you and I, Russell, own a CVS there, we may shut down. Businesses will leave, which makes your life harder, and you're not helping the people you're saying you're trying to help. Was that done on purpose to create instability. Now I'm entering a realm of conspiracy, and frankly, you're a very level-headed person. I'm interested in your thoughts because I cannot logically understand how someone would say this is a good idea.
I understand why you come to that hypothesis, and yeah, it may not be thoroughly wrong. I do think there's sometimes a danger in imputing too much rationality to the system. Sometimes just craziness happens, and you have to ask why they're not acting. Well, they're wimps. They're ideologically aligned. Maybe it's because they want to create instability. Clearly, there's been a divide between that part of the population that has to go out and work for a living and that part of the population that could stay at home in front of screens. Small businesses have suffered, and Amazon delivers. But I think I will not. I won't blame this all on Amazon. I will blame a big part of it on woke capitalism. I think there's a political realignment, going on in the United States. The blue collar voters, you're there in Newark, who are deeply loyal to the Democratic Party. I think they're moving more to the Republican side. Senator Hawley has said that the Republicans will become the party of the working class. This is, we'll have to see if that happens, but I think there is a kind of fluidity in party allegiance. Just a few more things on violence and lack of policing. The so-called justification for those riots was anti-racism. I want to put note for the record that in San Francisco, where I live, not that far from my house, the anti-racist rioters tore down a statue of Ulysses S. Grant, who you will remember led the armies against slavery in the Civil War. So this is just insane. There's no justification for that. There's been an attack on small business. I think that's been part of it. But here I'll go out a little bit on a limb. But I think it's right. One of the effects of the ideological attack on police has been to make police hesitant to act. Some police retired if they were close to that age. Others aren't being recruited, and some are just saying, listen, I'm not going to intervene because no one's going to have my back. I think there's that phenomenon as well. I have to wonder. I mean, we're still learning about what really transpired in the recent tragedy in Texas, but there's a criticism circulating that the police didn't intervene quickly enough. And I have to wonder if police didn't intervene because of this atmosphere in which the police are constantly under attack, because they know that no matter what they do, they will be demonized.
No, it's a good point. I didn't think of it that way, but that's valid.
It's absolutely right. Russell Berman joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe Pasillo, Joe Rossinello, and The Breach on the Veritas Catholic Network. We're discussing Russell's recent article in First Things magazine, The State of Emergency. I will say this real quick, Russell, just a quick comment. I thought 20 years ago, as I was starting to mature politically and all that and thinking about a lot of these things, I thought 20 years ago that realignment that you're describing would have happened then. I thought that and I still think now, this is kind of what we're seeing. The social conservative and the more blue collar on the one side and the more, let's face it, libertarian on the other. Recently, I don't know what conservatism is. We won't get into that today. I don't know how to define conservatism anymore based on what those in mainstream conservatism are telling us we need to embrace as conservatives, that guys like Joe and I, just quite frankly, Russell, we're not going to embrace. We're not going to try to find an accommodation on abortion. We are not in favor of transgenderism and gender ideology. We're just not. But conservatives now are trying to tell us we have to, because I think conservatism is starting to meld more into more of a libertarian, let's say, position. But again, that's a lot to go into. We don't want to know, because there's an important aspect of your article, which is going to take a little bit of time, and we want you to hash it out. You wrote, given our recent experience, we can identify 4 elements unique to our current situation that tempt our elite to pivot from democratic governance to emergency governance. And just if you don't mind hashing out those 4 elements of scientism, management of opinion. We've gotten into a little bit of this already. The role of victims and guilt, and targeting enemies. If you could comment on those 4 elements briefly, please.
Sure. At that point of the article, I was trying to describe some of the intellectual, if you will, thought framework around the possibility of state of emergency declarations that curtail liberty. The first point is scientism. Scientism is a term we use, maybe it's a little academic, but it refers to thinking about science in a dogmatic way, in a rigid way, therefore scientism. You all remember the follow the science, right? Or and the problem with that exhortation to follow the science is that scientists may disagree. In fact, the scientific method is all about disagreeing. When the politicians would say, well, there's a scientific consensus that X, Y, Z, they only can say that because they're excluding a bunch of scientists from the discussion. You remember the signs, we believe in science. Well, believing is, that's you do in faith, right? Science, you should test, you should question, you should experiment. The willingness to invoke science as an alibi for the exercise of unquestionable authority is the problem that I was trying to refer to there. With regard to management of opinion, you're right, we've talked about this already. The efforts to constrain public discussion, especially on the internet. Just a small footnote on that. When I went to college, like a bunch of centuries ago, there'd be controversial issues, but you would have debates, right? The pro and the con, right? Not that long ago in the Bay Area, there were debates, pro and con abortion, right? In the Bay Area, right? Now, you can't have debates about the controversial issues. You could not have a public debate about COVID measures, or about abortion, or about a myriad of other steps. We don't want. We're in a culture now where instead of trying to persuade your opponent, you want to deplatform your opponent. You want to silence your opponent. The third, the role of victims and guilt. One way you silence the opponent is by declaring the opponent to be fundamentally guilty. And the opponent then has to internalize that guilt. And all you can say is, I'm sorry, right? Not, you're right, I'm right. Maybe we'll find a compromise. We'll think it through. No, it's only because I'm deeply guilty. And we see this, and maybe that Ulysses S. Grant example is apt here. There have been very difficult, very regrettable aspects in American national history, but there have been enormous accomplishments and enormous achievements in terms of the pursuit of freedom, the pursuit of religious liberty, and the pursuit of prosperity. For all of the whining about American capitalism, it has produced enormous wealth for a broad middle class that does not exist elsewhere. So there are good stories to tell, including the abolition of slavery, and we owe Ulysses S. Grant, bless his soul, right, a whole lot for leading the armies against that, and that they tore down that statue, and that the city won't rebuild it is a scandal. But it's a scandal that is based on the assumption that we are primarily guilty, and we have to pay obeisance to a victim narrative on the other side. And then finally, targeting enemies. This is sort of cut from the same cloth. You're not on a level playing field with someone else who you're looking in their eye and saying, you know, what do you think? What do I think? Let's try to figure this out together. It's rather a declaration of the opponent as an enemy. The enemy because they're sexist, because they're anti-trans, because they're racist, etc.
You could just say deplorable, Russell. Just, you know, Hillary told us you could just say deplorable. It makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. But I think we should recognize that sometimes deplorable is adorable, we should not be forced into a corner where we become what they claim us to be. But we should not be afraid to stand by our beliefs, our traditions, our commitment to the institutions that we regard as important, no matter how much they decry them.
Professor Russell Berman joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe Pasillo, Joe Rossinello. This is, and we have a few minutes left, but this has been a fascinating conversation. We encourage all of you out there to go on firstthings.com, and read Professor Berman's article on the state of emergency. I want a 30-second comment from you, Russell, because we only have about 7 or 8 minutes left. I know Joe wants to get into a couple of things. The problem in a lot of tearing down these statues, whether it be Ulysses S. Grant, whether it be Junipero Serra in California in particular, that's civilized, okay, and brought the gospel and to the Native Americans living in California, tearing down his statue. The problem, a lot of it has to do with academia and these department heads and the individual professors. Not to knock them, because you're in academia, okay, but a quick comment. What do we do about that? Because a lot of these kids are not being taught to use their reason and intelligence. They're just being spoon-fed this stuff, and then they go out and tear down statues. Could you comment 30 seconds on that?
Yeah, listen, as I said before, history is our history, our national history, all human history is a mix of good and bad. And we shouldn't shy away from talking about the bad, but we should certainly shy away from claiming it as exclusively bad. And we should be proud of our accomplishments. I think it was shameful about the Grant statue, and I think it was shameful about the attacks on Sarah. Deeply ideological, just a subordination to a radical opinion to virtue signal. But better than virtue signaling would be real virtue, and that's what they lack.
No, thank you for that, Professor Berman. Joe Rossinello.
Russell, I want to ask you something, because to be honest with you, you're very level-headed, and I appreciate that. Actually, I try to be. I do. And
we try. We don't always succeed.
No, I do. And that's why, to be honest with you, we're blessed to have you on the show, because I think you bring a very unique perspective, and it's an important one. I wanted to ask you this, because I think we're similar in this regard, and we're similar in many regards, but in our working environment. I work in the corporate field, you work in academia, both of which are now under the yoke of wokeism. We both deal with this, and we're both educated, and we talk about science. There are things that are put forth that make no sense. You mentioned Latinx. I'll be honest with you. You explained that. I don't even know what that was. I'm glad you talked about that. I didn't even know what that was. And there's things I have to sit through where I'll just use an example. I'm married to an African-American woman, and people will jump on the fact and they'll say, "You're white, you're a racist." No, actually, I'm not. I have 5 interracial children. I'm married to an African-American woman. You don't know me, and you're saying, just because you're looking at me, that I'm a racist. And I think that goes on in the academic field as well. You read about things. People can't even speak at some colleges. Just speak and express an opinion in a kind and rational and level-headed way. How did we get here? How did we get here? Like, I'll be honest with you. I want to hear your opinion, because I respect it.
How we got here. Super interesting question. Something I think about I spoke a moment ago about how we should talk about the good and the bad in American history. I think part of the bad is Salem witch trials. A kind of hysteria grips the community, vilifies some outsiders, and it's a fire that just has to burn itself out. I think there's something like that in the American DNA, and that wokeism is the Salem witch trials of the 21st century. Massive intolerance, massive hostility to divergent opinion, arrogant self-confidence in self-righteousness. That's the right word. That goes on there. So that'd be one part of the answer. Another part of the answer, though, is going back to the beginning of our conversation. I think there have been some shocks to the system, and wokeism is a way for the powers that be to kick the country in the butt and say, you get back in line, right? I think the wokeism, whether it's a matter of the verbal ideologues or the mobs that terrorize the streets, are disciplinary tools in order to frighten people into silence or into compliance.
Yeah, one thing interesting, and then we're going to get into one final question that Joe and I feel is important. One of my friends that I work with is an atheist, let's call him a former Catholic atheist libertarian, and we disagree on a lot of things. But one thing we agree on, and it pertains to what you just said, is we both agree that when an individual says that's not up for debate, then there's a problem.
Yeah.
Joe and I are Roman Catholic men. We stand firm in our faith. We're not afraid to debate anybody on our faith. That's just that simple. You want to talk about it, we'll talk about it. We will never say that's not up for debate. Okay? When you hear that, that's when the red flag should start going off, when you're dealing with somebody who's not interested in arriving or striving towards some truth. Joe, we have 2 minutes left. Unfortunately, we're on radio. We have a time limit, Russell. Joe, where do you want to go for a final question for Russell Berman?
Well, let's talk about, basically you say this, and I want to, because I think this ends it on a very, very positive, uplifting note. You say, let us be confident that the elite's time is passing. Freedom can be restored. What is needed now is integrity, character, courage, and the patience to choose one's battles wisely, always with an eye on winning. We always say this before we speak, Joe and I, and we're, have strong opinions. We have to be people of integrity. Talk about that, because I think that's the solution, and I think it's a wonderful way to end the conversation.
Thank you. It's the end of the article too. Sometimes when we describe the challenges that we face, talking about wokeism and limiting of opinion, et cetera, and all that the country's been through in recent years, there's a tendency to, I don't want to say overstate it, but to paint a solely negative picture, and to lose sight of the fact that humans are resilient. We can be creative. We can resist this, but we have to be smart. We have to not become the caricature as which they represent us. They call us deplorable. That's not a reason to become deplorable. We should stand by our good positions. We shouldn't be afraid to examine them. And modify them if necessary, but think about winning.
Absolutely. That's a great place to end it. Russell Berman, we could go on for hours, and hopefully you'll agree to come back on the show at some point in the future. We'll hash it out again. I'm sure you got a lot of things more to say. We really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And thank you all out there for listening to us at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith in the New York City metropolitan area. Please be sure to download the app. Please be sure to follow Joe and I at the Frontline TV on YouTube. Like, subscribe, share, do all that fun stuff. And remember, until the next time, that our conversation is your conversation, and that conversation is going on everywhere. We'll